Hi, welcome to SureCloud's discussion around CMMC 2.0. My name is Craig Moores. I'm responsible for SureCloud's risk advisory practice. I'm joined today by Tom Cornelius. Tom, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please, and maybe share some of your background and experience for everyone?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Tom Cornelius. I'm the senior partner at ComplianceForge, also founder of the Secure Controls Framework, and also help run the CMMC Center of Awesomeness.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. So I guess for everybody, before we start, it's important to note, that we don't have specifics around CMMC 2 at the moment. Therefore, we're going to try and keep our discussion sort of to a fairly generalized level. So we won't focus on answering any specific contextualized questions. However, you're welcome to reach out to either Tom or I to discuss those further at a more convenient time. Our details will be posted a bit later on. If you'd like a question answered, please post it in the chat for everyone to read. We'll get to those a bit later on towards the end of the discussion. So let's start with the first of our 6 key topic areas. So Tom, what is CMMC 2.0 first off?
Sure. So again, if you haven't taken the time to read it, I know Craig is going to post the actual link to the official model page. Make a cup of coffee, read through it. It'll be good for you. But really, when you look at it, 2.0 takes CMMC back to the basics of NIST 800-171. This goes back to DFARS 7012, that clause that required compliance with 800-171. As of January 1st, 2018. So really, it's just hitting the reset button, a little over 4 years ago. And, we'll cover a little more of the nuances here. But one of the things that's not going to affect a lot of contractors is 2.0 did add a little bit of an escape clause in for urgent DoD purchases, where they'd be able to have a limited waiver process to exclude CMMC requirements on the front end of a contract. For what are called mission critical requirements. This would go all the way up to some senior level of the DoD leadership and also have a limited time duration. So it wouldn't be completely avoiding the requirements. It would just be instead of front loading it before a contract is awarded, it would be placing probably during or after. And again, like everything with 2.0, it's all more information is forthcoming, but we don't know when that's going to be.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. I think that's pretty clearly articulated. But again, as Tom said, go away and have a read. There are obviously some changes there that you should be aware of, and hopefully we're going to cover a few of those next. So I guess that's a good time, Tom, to come on to what some of the practical changes are that are associated with the release of the second version. What are some of those practical changes?
Sure. And so right off the bat, and again, the DoD official website has some decent graphics that help paint that picture, but it drops the model from 5 different levels to 3, where it essentially deletes out the old levels 2 and 4. So level 1 stays level 1, which is really just the basic cybersecurity requirements. Level 2 is the 110 CUI controls, which was the former level 3. And the new level 3 is the old level 5, where the guidance on that so far is that instead of what the old model had for level 5, it's level 3 is likely going to look like all of level 2, which are the 110 CUI controls from 171, and then some mixture of controls from NIST 800-172, which I believe is a catalog of 35 controls. So at worst, it would add an additional 35 controls, and those are going to be, the biggest DoD contractors. So it's really not going to affect much of the defense industrial base or the DIB at all. But when you kind of look at what excites most people about level 2, or sorry, CMMC 2.0, is that it's removing some of the trouble points around CMMC, especially this concept of zero deficiency. Where that concept was, it was always unattainable by the DIB, but at least CMMC 2.0 really acknowledges that. So there is going to be some type of plan of action milestone, POAM option for compensated controls. Again, more information that's forthcoming. And with these changes, your level 1 and some amount of level 2 organizations seeking certification, OSCs, are going to be able to perform a self-assessment. And these higher risk level 2 OSCs are going to have to still do a third-party assessment, through a commercial third party, these C3PAOs. And then level 3 is reserved for the DoD. Likely DIBCAC will assess those. So from a pure risk management perspective, which should make a lot of cybersecurity practitioners very happy, is this idea of a senior official, within the OSC is going to have to sign off on annual compliance attestations in the SPURS, the Supplier Performance Risk System. So it's going to take it away from like your cybersecurity, manager, or, whoever's been, doing the grunt work on CMMC, from them putting the information in SPURS, and that, that low man on the totem pole being, held liable. So it's taking the risk away from cybersecurity and putting it back where it needs to be, on likely some type of VP from the line of business, or it could be like SOX, where you have the CIO, CISO, or CO signing off on, as the senior official. Where that's going to be a very contentious issue is that brings personal liability around it with False Claims Act, potential violations. So I heard numerous issues with people not wanting to put to submit their SPURS score, because they really weren't very happy with it, but essentially it was they do it or they get fired. And this is where it's going to take a little bit of that ethical dilemma away, where your cybersecurity team is going to be able to say, hey, great, this is what we feel the SPURS score is. If you want to say you're 110 out of 110, and we say you're 80 out of 110, you're the one who's going to attest to it. And if you lie, then good luck with a possible FCA violation. And it was kind of interesting to see, about a week before CMMC 2.0 came out, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, released a new program specifically around False Claims Act, where they're trying to revamp that they realize that third-party assessments probably aren't going to, pull, or uncover a lot of issues. But qui tam, lawsuits, or just other, the threat of a False Claims Act might really be the best thing to cause these defense contractors to actually do the right thing. So a little bit of a, more of a stick than a carrot, but, anything essentially helps at this point with CMMC.
Thanks, Tom. I think there's quite a few pieces in there that are obviously quite relevant to people, but I guess, maybe thinking a bit more on the consequence side of it. I mean, can you explain how it might change tracking instances of non-compliance with the POAMs?
Yeah, that's going to be, again, this is one of the biggest issues of frustration, where given a lack of guidance, since I think this came out in November, is that while it's fantastic that information came out on that POAMs will be acceptable, there's no specification about what controls will and will not be able to be POAM'd, the duration of those, and even the process for how do you actually submit it, what's the expected time to review, and what format will you get back. Because if you go through an assessment and you don't have a quote unquote, DoD CIO approved POAM, POAM item, then that doesn't exist. Because if you go back to DFARS, DoD CIO is the only agency that's essentially currently able to grant a POAM, approval. So all that information still has to be defined by the DoD, and likely this is just discussion with other peers. What's currently in the DoD assessment methodology, the DAM, for doing the self-assessment for SPURS, there are several controls in there labeled as a 5-pointer, where you can't have any failure. So it's likely those will be the ones that you can't POAM. But still, this goes to the aspect of companies that from a segmentation perspective, or from a from a tool that might simply not be able to, be configured in a way to meet a control, that would have failed everything under a zero defect, rule. This now gives them hope to be able to, do true risk management. It could be through compensated controls, through segmentation, or enhanced monitoring, or something along those lines, just as a company would do for PCI compliance with any type of compensated control. Hopefully they'll follow some type of rational, clear way to do it. But again, it's a wait and see at this point for POAMs.
Thanks, Tom. So I've got an associated question in that case then. So obviously there's quite a lot of consequence attached to getting this wrong. So how do organizations prepare for the overall management of CMMC 2? We discussed tooling a lot, but is this a good point for organizations to look at tooling a bit closer in order to support them and help them understand more around their kind of ongoing compliance?
It really is, and this is where assumptions are really what you want to avoid. And while it is possible to manage a POAM through an Excel spreadsheet, it's really not, a small person, several person company could do that fine. But when you start looking at complex organizations, multiple teams, Excel doesn't cut it. And this is really where you need some type of GRC solution that can actually assign a control, request evidence, request attestation, so that you actually have some type of paper trail of what work is outstanding, who's done it, where the evidence is. And that's the type of stuff that if you have good, clear documentation, that makes any type of third-party attestation, or third-party audit or assessment much easier, because really having clear evidence is more than half the battle when you're able to sit down with an auditor and share with them your evidence of policy, standard procedures, POAM items, or just if it's clear and they're able to dive into it. One, since you're paying on an hourly basis, it makes it much more cost effective, to actually have the assessment. But then for them, if they can actually see that you have your act together, it makes it much more pleasant because they realize you're not trying to BS them throughout the entire process. And again, I'm an optimist where, ideally people are going to go into it and genuinely, feel, yes, we've done our pre-assessments. We know we've got all the evidence that's necessary, and then just be able to walk through and show an assessor. There will be people who try and BS their way through because they know they're not perfect, and hopefully those will get caught.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think assurance here is what auditors are looking for, isn't it? So the more you can show that consolidation of your kind of thought process, and you're showing robust, repeatable processes, obviously you're demonstrating that greater kind of in-depth knowledge of what you're looking at and ultimately how you're managing it. So I guess with that in mind, then, whether an organization chooses to use a tooling, associated tooling, or a platform, or Excel, how do organizations prepare for self-assessment? What should they expect?
Sure. So, and this is where it's interesting. You've got quite a few tools that still just focus on the 110 controls versus looking at, down to the assessment objective, level, which is several hundred controls. And it seems a little bit overwhelming for different people, but when you're going through your pre-assessment, or even just your annual, you legitimately cannot answer your SPURS score, like putting that in if you're using the 110 COI controls. To be able to answer a self-assessment through SPURS, you still have to go through and use the assessment objectives in 171 alpha, which are the same things that are in the CMMC assessment guide. It's the same material. So going through there and having answers to every AO is the only way to properly prepare for either your own SPURS score, self-attestation, or for a third-party assessment.
So I guess to some degree, it's the same expectation as setting up for any audit. Then it's knowing that you've got that robust, repeatable process, supporting evidence, obviously, and then demonstrating that to to the auditor with a level of assurance, really, that you're applying a pragmatic sort of management structure around this to be able to demonstrate your compliance. So I guess from a third-party assessment perspective, then, if we look at kind of a slightly different flavor of that, what should organizations expect with third-party assessments?
Sure, and this is where I do have my own opinions on this, but realistically, it should be when you look at evidence of due care and due diligence to identify are you doing what's right, or are you being negligent with this. It really comes down to what a reasonable person in a similar situation would would feel meets the intent of the control. So that's how, when you start answering your assessment objectives and finding out do we have the appropriate level of evidence, you have to take that step back and say, if we hired someone else or third party came in here, would they find that reasonable, or are you essentially just a little bit too much wishful thinking? So this is where I think you really have to take that level of detail into it, because when you start looking at the third-party assessments, I really do feel it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I've personally met some very quality assessors who are going to become C3PAOs, which is great. Some of these are former SOX, PCI, auditors. So they've been there, they've done that, they understand proper role, how an assessment is supposed to be covered, what appropriate evidence looks like and such. But there are quite a few who have no backgrounds in audits or assessments, and they fundamentally don't understand the audit process or what evidence is. And for example, I've met some that they feel that they're going to be able to perform an assessment by just using the interview and test criteria from the assessment objectives, and not use anything in examine, which covers documentation. So because these kind of go back to the arguments of when you look at 800-171, some people feel that you just have to do the controlled unclassified information controls and not the non-federal organization controls, which are essentially documentation. But when you look at the assessment objectives, everything in there from examine covers policies, procedures, and other associated documentation. And it's really sad to see some of these third-party assessors are saying, oh, well, it doesn't say I have to use all of these, I can just pick and choose. And some are saying, I don't even have to look at evidence, I can just interview and observe, which is it's sad. And that goes to the level of the assessor, which is going to mean that some of these third-party assessments are going to be a joke, which brings in another issue of, if you have a third-party assessment that is weak, or the contractor feels that maybe they don't like the results of the C3PO, how is the CMMC AB actually going to deal with any type of challenge? And at this point, it's questionable how much oversight the AB is going to have on ensuring assessments or quality products. So ultimately, the CMMC AB is supposed to be reporting these results to the DoD, and it's only going to be time will tell if that process works or not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think coming from a kind of audit-based background, and having several kind of audit qualifications myself, I think one of the things that we always struggle with is consistency in audit approach, and demonstrating that there's a reasonable level of assurance that underpins the results that come out of these individual audits. So I think you picked up on one of the areas there, which is probably the one that I see the most, which is around evidence. So what can people expect for evidence requirements for CMMC 2? I mean, you just alluded to it there, but I mean, what would you suggest in your experience is to be expected for those evidential requirements?
Sure, and this is what's kind of funny in some ways, is that if you for the people who are familiar with version 1 to version 2, people are saying, great, we don't have to do any of this other documentation stuff from the the processes. And when you really look at it, the evidence doesn't change. Companies still have to have their policies, standards, procedures, SSP, incident response, all these other kind of things that are needed to demonstrate evidence of due diligence and due care. So there is no like removal of of documentation or evidence required. So this is really where it kind of goes back to that aspect of make that pot of coffee, block off time on the calendar and really read through 171 alpha, or pick the CMMC assessment guide and look at what that actually means. When it's saying, do you have this, do you have this documentation, yes, no, and you have to really, answer it honestly. And it goes back to that reasonable person's perspective. If a reasonable person, would come in and say, you really, if you're talking about how you're going to manage, like incidents as a whole, and you don't have an incident response plan, that from a reasonable person's perspective, they're saying it's like, well, yeah, you're really not doing that. You would be doing it in an ad hoc manner that would just be, fly by the seat of your pants, which really doesn't meet the intent of the control. So if you find that you're kind of like shrugging your shoulders a little bit and saying like, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't meet the intent of the control, err on the side of safety and say it doesn't meet the intent. And that's when you really need to document, specifically to your organization, what do you do? If you're a 5-person organization and you're wearing all the hats, well, your incident response procedures are going to be relatively, basic. But if you're a 10,000 person organization with, an entire team dedicated to incident response, where you've got, an expectation for, for a certain level of maturity, then your documentation should be, much more, robust and mature. So look at it from a reasonable person's perspective, because at the end of the day, if you ever had a False Claims Act violation, brought against you, and you've got to, defend yourself, in court or, to a deposition, that's really what it's going to come down to. From a reasonable perspective, based on our company size and our level of maturity and what we're doing, A, B, C, D was sufficient, at that time. And that's really how it needs to be viewed.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Thanks, Tom. So I've got a side question related to that around
Sure.
something that I see quite a lot now around unified control frameworks and continuous control monitoring. How do you think, how do you think CMMC will fit with organizations that are looking at consolidating, their controls down into a unified controls framework and looking at measuring those over a longer period of time? What potential impact might CMMC 2 have, positive or negative on that?
It really comes down to evidence, of the, assigning the control, is it, are they meeting the intent of the assessment objective? And this is where any type of internal audit or pre-assessments are really going to matter, where when you really kind of, chop up what CMMC is, there is quite a bit that is, on the technical team. But, you do have, say, personnel security, HR, you've got procurement, you've got all these other, non-technical teams involved that do have controls that are going to be, assigned to them. So someone does need to, be the, cat herder and, go and actually make sure that the appropriate evidence exists. So, using something like the Secure Controls Framework or UCF or other, meta framework, control sets, they can be great. And that's especially useful when you're looking at possibly having, multiple compliance obligations, or one control that can be used against multiple different, statutory, regulatory, or contractual obligations. That's great, but also it always comes down to the evidence. Do you have the evidence to meet the AO?
Thanks, Tom. I think there were some really great points through there. And thanks for sharing your knowledge on them as well. I think obviously, when more information comes out, obviously, if anybody does have any follow-on questions, you're more than happy to reach out to Tom or I, as I said earlier.
One thing on there, and one thing that we're seeing is that since you have CMMC with the DoD is, an immediate need for a lot of companies. And, where they're saying, hey, we have to, we have to do this, or we're not going to, get a contract. But they still have other compliance obligations that they've put on the back burner. So once they get a handle on CMMC, they're going to start looking at these meta frameworks and saying, okay, great. How can I roll up, what I'm doing for CMMC to address, GDPR, CCPA, PCI, all these other, different things. And that's where the meta frameworks will be, useful. But again, it's evolving and maturing, their compliance obligation, like how they're governing that.
Yes, great point. Thanks for adding that, Tom. Okay, so I think hopefully everybody took something valuable from that. Thanks to Tom. I have had a quick look. There aren't any specific questions raised by anybody. So if you do have a question you want to ask of Tom or myself, please do post it into the chat now. You can also, obviously, I think I saw our LinkedIn details in there as well. Feel free to come and connect with us. Otherwise, please drop us a message if you do have something more specific that you want to talk about. Tom, have you got anything else that you want to add at this point?
No, on this, again, it's wait and see. I mean, it's great to go read through, the link that's going to be shared. It's really important to read source material yourself, and just don't take my word for it or stuff you read off of LinkedIn. It really behooves you to go and read the source material.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Thank you for your time today, and to everybody that's joined. We hope to see you all again soon. And as I say, if you do have any questions for us afterwards, please do connect with us and feel free to ask those. Otherwise, we hope to see you at one of our sessions in the future. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon or day wherever you are.